All right, my name is Gary Toth. I think some of you have seen me talk here before. Worked at the New Jersey Department of Transportation for 34 years. I'm a transportation engineer. Later in my career, we began to figure out that we weren't going to solve the congestion problem in the conventional way that we had all been trained, which is to find a project, run the numbers, try to figure out how to widen the lanes, and then spend the next 25 or 30 years trying to fight through the environmental process and the community process. We also figured out that we weren't going to ever again raise the money to build all of these projects, and that the way that we were building them was causing suburbanization in our state and producing traffic at rates 3 to 4 to 5 times faster than we could build the roads even if we had the money. So we had to turn to new approaches. Those new approaches were basically dealing with network, particularly tying in the local network, going outside of our jurisdiction, dealing with the land use. This portion of the talk will reflect some of the case studies. I think we've had a rich discussion here on the theory and the benefits behind this. My role in this panel is to show you that it can be done. A bit of disclosure before. Only about 10% of what I'm about to present to you has been built, and the reason being that we did this stuff from 2004 up to 2008. Even I left in 2007, but some of the stuff continued on. And then the bottom fell out of the financial market in New Jersey, like it did in a lot of places. And pretty much now New Jersey DOT has retreated to simply maintaining the system, which is what a lot of folks were calling for anyway. But the ability to go in and invest in any kind of capacity increase project has greatly diminished. Nonetheless, the theory that you can work with communities and you can pull this off, and folks at the MPO level, state DOT level, metropolitan area level can successfully build network and solve a lot of the problems in ways that are easier and produce better and more sustainable outcomes, I think is demonstrated by this. So I'm just going to run right into the case studies, and I'm going to go from a range from new development, rapidly developing areas, to right down through suburban and rural and retrofit of suburban. This is a place outside of Philadelphia. It's about 45 minutes from Philadelphia, and we were dealing with 2 towns that were projected to grow from 5,000 to 50,000. They were projected to grow in the conventional way, which was to just build suburban style subdivisions, do not connect the network, yet they wanted us to maintain the state highway at its rural characteristics. Just think about that, increasing your population from 5,000 to 50,000 and not building a network and spreading out your development and just assuming that the state DOT could figure out how to deal with it. We went out and we worked with them over a period of time in partnership with our MPO, the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, and we successfully, in advance of the development, laid out the network that you see here. This is one of the towns. It's called Woolwich, and so the network was laid out in advance, and so the developers, when they came in fact, they are building some of this now. This is being built because it's being built to a certain extent by the private sector. They slowed down as well because of the recession. And then we went to the adjacent communities and did the same thing with them to lay out the network in advance of the development. And then what you can see subtly is we also then laid out some connections between the towns. And the whole idea was that you did this urbanism, all the stuff that Fred and Mike and Ian talked about before, about how that tight grid of a network fosters urbanism, fosters walkability, fosters transit, changes the density of development. But then also by building the parallel connections and moving some of the commercial stuff off the state highway, we were able to keep the pressure off the main highway. The state highway didn't have to take all of the load, and so set up a plan where the state highway can function without a $500 million investment, $500 million that New Jersey doesn't have, to keep up with the development. So there was an application of network planning for undeveloped and rural areas, and all 3 of the communities here bought on to the principle, so it's not impossible. This is a first-tier suburban town outside of Trenton. It's one town east of Trenton, New Jersey, our state capital. A little unclear I think, from the slide, but that white building over there, it's a gray field. It's a shopping center that had some stores still in it, some vacancies. Totally disconnected from the network, totally no pedestrian access, all sorts of suburban street connections next to it. And we worked with the community and got buy-in to build a connected network and infill some of the development in a way that it had a Main Street type of feel, walkable type of stuff. You guys were talking before about layering pedestrian networks on top of street networks. When you go into a suburban area that's been used to having no through connections for 50 years, it's a little difficult politically to build the car connections, but we work with them and successfully convince them to have pedestrian and bicycle connections out through the back so that they can have almost their own private access into the shopping center, and again, the more robust shopping center after the infill. And they were happy about it. They actually now have, they don't have to get in their car to a pizzeria that they could have thrown a football to and drive into it because they had to go all the way around. They can actually walk into it now. Edison, New Jersey, former Revlon site, happens a lot around the country where they moved on to greener pastures, and ultimately I think Revlon went bankrupt. What to do? It's a highly suburban town, which you can see in the top, in your case, left-hand corner of the screen is the Northeast Corridor, and rather than follow the Edison's on-the-books suburban codes and zoning, we worked with the township, and that's a state highway, by the way. That's at the bottom. So we worked with the township to develop a mixed-use walkable grid, ultimately positioning this site to have a station on the Northeast Corridor, and then also being able to serve it because of its density and its walkability with bus service. And of course, the mixed use also helps foster that. But one of the keys is the connections in the network. And then, of course, as some of the other speakers were talking about, making the streets more walkable, retrofitting the streets. This is the existing Northeast Corridor station in Edison. Take a look at it. Well, I don't know what the opposite of TOD is. You know, transit repellent development. So that's been there for 30 or 40 years. We work with the Township of Edison to help them redevelop, to actually do something that made them happy. More chance of getting ratables, but do so to take advantage of the presence of a major asset there. And again, then you got to go in with the streets. It's hard to talk about the network without talking about the streets, unless you want to get in trouble with Peter Firth. Getting there, Peter. And then you got to take advantage of the investment that Public Works or the state DOT puts into the streets by following along with your land use. Some rural areas in New Jersey, and yes, there are rural areas in New Jersey that, which you can see the red lines with the dashes and the connections, as we were trying to take the pressure off of, that's Route 9, the big road down there. Folks, again, didn't want their rural, quote unquote rural, 2-lane roadway converted to a typical 4-lane divided highway with cloverleaf interchanges. We said to them, if that's what you want, then you have to work with us on providing connections in your existing street network so that you can get people around without everybody having to go out on the state highway. One of the disadvantages of a disconnected network is that people end up having to use the big road that they want to use to go long distances. They have to use it for local trips because they've intentionally, by the network design, forced everything out on the state highway. So here in the Route 9 Ocean County area, we were able to successfully develop plans for future connections as development comes in, or with state and local investment. Just another example. Just so you know, New Jersey's not the only place doing this. This is some work that Harrison Rue did when he was back in Virginia with connecting the network. Pennsylvania's done it. Utah's done it to a small extent. Maine has got one of the great case studies, I think, in the country in terms of, in the Maine Gateway 1 corridor, terms of using the network and dealing with land use to foster sustainability, ultimately livability. These guys talked about the benefits of connectivity. I'm not going to go through this again. I just flashed it up there as an introduction to some case studies of how network can help deal with things like create and foster walkability, context-sensitive solutions, and livability. This is Vermont. And those two roadway sections that you see are about 2 miles apart. And if you look to the section on the right, the state highway is supported by a rich network of streets. Somebody told me in the previous session, somebody from Burlington said they just passed an ordinance now. Every street in Burlington, the speed limit, every street except for 2 in Burlington, Vermont, the speed limit's going to be 25 miles an hour now. And they're going to design to that, and they're starting to right-size their streets. But they're able to do it because they have this rich network. No one street has to carry the load. As opposed to South Burlington, 2 miles south, you can see because of the disconnection of the network and the dumping of all the local land uses out on the state highway, the road is widened and it's still congested. So a case study to demonstrate how this benefits things is Route 31 in Flemington, New Jersey. It's in the center part of New Jersey, about 15 minutes from Pennsylvania. Still semi-rural. You can see the sparseness of the grid out there. And for years, we were trying to pursue a bypass that involved wetlands, historic districts, and so on, rural historic districts, farmland. That was going to cost up to 120 to 150 million. We came in, realized we couldn't afford it. We just never going to happen. So we started working with the developers in advance and the county and the 2 municipalities to lay out. You can see the green line is where the bypass, state bypass would have been, and ultimately we tied in the local network. So a lot of these developments, some of them were malls and some of them were office campuses, they would have had what I like to call the rat maze, where it was one way in, you go around a circle, it collects everybody, and then dumps it back out on the state highway. So we ended up laying out the ability to build grid by the private sector at no extra cost to the state. But by taking a lot of pressure off the state highway, we reduced the demand volumes for the roadway to the point that we could cut the cost of the state highway almost in half. And we did that 2 ways, one of which was less volume because the local grid was actually carrying a lot of the load that the state highway would have had to carry. But also by doing something I talked about in another session, by reducing the design speed and the concept from the bypass from a freeway that was going to be designed at 70 miles an hour and therefore needed grade separations, bridges, huge interchanges, and turning it into a 35 mile an hour design roadway, sort of following the principle that Fred was talking about, that you could travel along at 35 miles an hour and you can get to a lot of places almost as fast at 35 as you can at 60. And that was the sketch. That used to be a 4-lane thing, looked like a freeway, and this was the concept that we were about to move forward before the plug got pulled on the finances. Hopefully someday we all won't be broke again and New Jersey will be able to move forward with this plan. So some of the other benefits, I talked about the reduction in cost. It's much cheaper if we build the network. It's much cheaper on government because the private sector is building tons of infrastructure anyway. They're building roads. Residential subdivisions are building roads that provide no benefit other than to get people in and out of their houses, which is an important benefit, but we're not capturing that investment for regional use and for public use. Same thing with the developers. They're building all sorts of infrastructure to support their commercial development, offices, and so on, so we can recapture some of that. Another thing is that you can phase the actual construction. You can phase the investment over years. We were able to actually put together a plan that had the bottom not fallen out, we would have been able to fund over 20 years because you can build it in pieces. It wasn't one big roadway that only made sense to be built at once. Some of this actually got built. This lane continuity project on the existing Route 31 was built. We changed some of the intersections. I won't say improved. I know all about Ian's chastising me. Improved for who? We made all sorts of investments in other roadways, and this stuff hasn't gotten built because, again, the real estate market has slowed down. But the whole project, another advantage is the project can be built in pieces. And we did some of the planning for some of the local subdivisions to change them from cul-de-sacs and traditional suburban style stuff to walkable communities and some mixture of use. I want to show a case study that already exists, and this is something that Ian and I worked on when we were down in Savannah. And we noted that if you take a look, you know how you can cut through a tree and you can tell the history of the climate based on looking at the cross sections? Well, this one street, Abercorn, started in the rich historic center of Savannah and moved all the way outward, and the development followed over a period of time, and so it sort of gave a tree-type cross-section of what was going on over time. You can see from the introductory slide, just look at the density of the grid as you evolved over time, kind of like the slide that Mike showed, how the grid has decayed over time, and it did. Savannah was no exception. So you go into the historic district, and they've got this dense grid. They've got more narrow streets, and then some crazy guy actually went in there and put squares in the middle of it, so you can't even flow through. You've got to go around. The interesting thing is that downtown Savannah is outperforming the rest of Abercorn Street in every way possible. It's carrying more cars. The travel time is better. The property values are higher. The density of development per square mile is higher. And then as you move on, you can begin to see the grid begins to break down. They begin to put more and more pressure on Abercorn Street to carry the load. Still early enough that you've got some context sensitivity. You still got a reasonable amount of density being supported. Streetcar comes in, highways, or the automobile begins to come in, road gets a little wider, and of course, all hell breaks loose post-World War II, and the same street has to be wider to carry less cars at poorer travel time and less density being supported and lower property values. So there's a lot of reasons for this, but clearly I think that the idea of using network to diffuse the traffic is one of the critical ones. We codified this at New Jersey DOT in a publication we put together jointly with Pennsylvania DOT called the Smart Transportation Guide, and so there's information in there about we've got to stop trying to solve everything like Tim the tool time guy, more power. We have to try to stop solving things that way and come up with partnerships and look for a network of solutions, not big ones. Some bonus coverage here. That was the end of my presentation, but we're talking about ways of measuring connectivity, and I wanted to share one of my favorite ones. It comes from the Indianapolis Multimodal Guidelines. You can Google Indianapolis Multimodal Corridor Guidelines, and this will come up. But they've come up with something pretty cool. They have an exercise where they talk about in the urban areas, go in and calculate your closed loops. So if you have sidewalks on 3 sides of a block but not 4th, that doesn't count as a closed pedestrian loop. Same thing with your bicycle loops. You can do it for transit and so on. And then they have recommendations and set targets for what you should be to functioning at a very good level. There's the numbers: bikes and peds, 50 closed loops per square mile; automobiles, 40 per square mile. In the example that they showed for a TOD district that they were working on, the existing was 0 bicycle loops in that square mile. Actually, that's 2 square miles, that particular example, and only 17 per square mile for pedestrian. So they used it as a way to inspire and educate the folks working on this of the need to begin to close all those pedestrian loops and to close the bike loops. And to make Peter happy, they particularly realized that a dense network wasn't of full value if you couldn't cross it. And while they didn't want to go in there and they didn't have the money to necessarily invest in every crossing, that you could see the yellow dots there are points where they had identified were critical places where you needed the multimodal crossings, whether it was bicycle, pedestrian, bus, and cars, and they highlighted those as special areas to make sure that the road wasn't a barrier. And this is what they're fostering all through the Indianapolis metropolitan area. It's not just the city, it's the MPO, so it's a number of cities in the county are using this now as guidance. And finally, to amplify some of the stuff that these folks were talking about, the whole idea of that slowing down to 30 miles an hour or 25 miles an hour doesn't necessarily cost us travel time. This is a slide I like to show. That's a picture of the former head of Washington DOT, Doug McDonnell, who was trying to pass this on. He had a contest around the state. How can we best demonstrate this principle? This was the winning entry. Take 2 beakers of rice, take 2 funnels, empty one slowly, take the other one and dump it in all at once. Which beaker ends up getting to its destination faster, right? You know the answer. I think we've all faced that somewhere in time. And, you know, you start thinking about our cities and our urban areas and what we've been doing. And so you come to places like Los Angeles, which has a connected network. It may be a little too macro by our standards, but it's more connected than a lot of places. But they, if I can go backwards, mistakenly, without thinking about the whole system, decided that if they widened all their streets, that they were going to get people places faster. So in addition to at 30 miles an hour, you probably get more throughput because of the rice and the beaker thing. They also, you can see that massive traffic jam on 4th Street, or maybe it's 5th Street, in Los Angeles. And the reason is rice in the funnel, that they designed all their streets, and so people speed up to the traffic jam. It doesn't make any sense. So that's the end of my talk. That actually is a wall in New Jersey. The guy who owned that property was fed up with New Jersey DOT after we widened Route 70 in Cherry Hill. And that's a quote from Omar Bradley. Those of you guys that saw the movie Patton know that Omar Bradley was the guy that kept Patton out of trouble most of World War II, or tried to keep him out of trouble most of World War II. And yeah, so if we're not careful and we don't think about what we're doing here, we're just going to be creating more congested places like the ones we left behind. Okay. Any questions? Peter?
You made me very happy.
That was my goal. I only had one goal for getting on that airplane and coming to Charlotte.
I want to amplify something about those last 2 slides because, you know, mostly as a pedestrian bicycle organization, we don't talk much about freeways. But freeways make a heck of a lot of difference. A freeway with 2 lanes per direction just can't dump that much traffic at an interchange. A freeway with 4 lanes, 6 lanes per direction, dumps so much traffic that then our arterial roads are being made 6 lanes, 8 lanes wide in order to handle those. So if we want, you know, human scale, civilized arterial roads, one of the keys to that is resisting, you know, 8-lane freeways. You see that like in I-270 north of Washington or around Reston, Virginia, where you know, the roads that you say, why do we have this 6-lane, 8-lane road? It's because so much traffic coming off of one interchange.
Well, how many folks here have worked in highway project development, either on an EIS or inside an agency developing projects? How often did you work on the whole system versus I'm studying I-270 from milepost 22.3 to 27, right? And what happens is streets, not the best example, but street design like this is the basis of, we studied our system in pieces. And so you go in and you say, you do your volume, the capacity ratios, you figure out that the demand is to get 5,000 cars during the peak hour out to a roadway. And so we size the street accordingly and we widen it. And we put this mega investment in it in an era, and today we can't afford that kind of investment. Nobody ever bothered to check, A, was there a capacity restraint that kept some of those cars from getting to that point, or B, what happens when they get to the funnel, when the rice gets to the funnel. So a lot of our American system has been designed piece by piece, running the numbers, made sense for a 5-mile stretch or a 1-mile stretch, but not for the whole system.
I once heard from a regional planner
My answer is that we plan proactively, not reactively. What you described is reactive planning done in silos. So the highway department says it's not my business to influence the shape of the growth. My job is to just run the calculations and figure out how many lanes to build, and we get what we get. Proactive planning is, a lot of places around the country now are doing scenario planning. They decide what they want their region to look like, and then they constrain the system. They plan the whole system based on the fact that we just can't afford to provide that capacity, or we don't want to afford to provide that capacity, or even if we can, the outcomes are unsustainable. So places like Sacramento, Salt Lake City, Maine, with their Gateway 1 project, worked with folks to say, here's the kind of development we want, and here's the kind of infrastructure that we're going to be able to support. We call it at PPS upside down planning. Figure out the future you want. And so you think about the example that I talked about in that Route 31 project. It wasn't just the network, it was also the land use, the way we arrayed the land use. It basically cut the traffic volumes in half. Does that sound right? Anybody want to add to that?
I think if there's a silver lining to the black economic cloud that we're in now, it may be that a couple of the truisms that we had 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. One was real estate values will always go up. We all believed that at some point. The other was, the corollary of that was traffic volumes will always increase at some rate. And both of those have been proven wrong. Traffic volumes are going down in a lot of places. So if nothing else, it's testing the way we used to do things and how we make assumptions about things.
If you go do some research on some of the better scenario planning projects around the country, and I cited a couple of them, Salt Lake City, Sacramento, Charlottesville, Virginia, the Thomas Jefferson Planning District did this. They would come up with several scenarios. We did some of this in New Jersey. You come up with several scenarios and you take the same amount of population growth and the same amount of employment growth, and you figure out how to array it and how to support it with network design. And the numbers are actually stunning, how much cheaper it is how much less highway infrastructure you have to build, and even other infrastructure. In Salt Lake City, they figured out that by clustering their development in ways that the community, and it's just a big community, not just Salt Lake City, but it was 50 miles north and south between the ranges up there, that the sewerage and the stormwater and all that other infrastructure, it was much less expensive and brought it all down into affordability. So it's proactive. You just can't allow the cities to plan and the communities to plan on their own, the transit people to plan their line, like the transit repellent development in Edison. We can't let that stuff happen anymore.
You talked about the connectivity recommendations and the smart transportation guidebook. I'm pretty sure that I think it's Virginia has a state law that in general prohibits cul-de-sacs. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. If there's something like that, is that something like that appropriate for a state law?
Well, you're asking a couple questions, right? Is it appropriate for a state law? Yeah, I think so. I think that it's a tough political thing. You can see what's going on now, that the ultra-conservative movement in this country is opposing all planning, saying that it's taking away property rights. So it's a tough environment to do it, but in terms of creating a sustainable future, the government is going to have to step in and steer some of this, because it creates the incentives and disincentives that influences the market. So yes, I think we need connectivity indices and things like the ITE guidance on spacing of arterials and all the sorts of streets and transit networks, or the Indianapolis example. I mean, there's choose your poison, I guess, on how you're going to approach this. But absolutely, the Smart Transportation Guide for Pennsylvania and New Jersey was a little soft on it. I mean, it talked about it. It gave some general principles. It referred to ITE a lot, but it didn't. It didn't come in as well as Indianapolis and specify in great detail. Anybody else? What do you guys think?
I have a question for you. gotten any feedback, you know, to the work you've done or anything that you guys have done talking about connectivity? Because like it just makes sense that providing more routes for emergency responders would be something that would benefit them.
I think that's kind of reflective. As anyone from Charlotte, I was here 3 years ago for a CNU Transportation Summit. There's a big focus on what Charlotte was doing to improve connectivity. They just looked at the amount of fire stations they'd have to build per square mile, whatever it was, to service their current growth pattern. They realized they could save millions by building a grid just because the response time would be faster, require less infrastructure and policemen and pensions and all that going out. So if anyone from Charlotte has more information on that, that's about as much as I know about it, but it's quite interesting to see it put through that lens.
I've often wondered why the fire department comes in, it's like traffic engineering on traffic calming. I've never seen them come in and go to the planning commission and say, no, we don't want this development in cul-de-sacs.
Well, I think the answer is because just like we designed, us highway engineers designed a system piece by piece. We thought about what was put in front of our nose at the moment. The fire departments thought about what was put in front of their nose, and emergency responders at the moment. And so when they came in and somebody was talking about building a street that might not have been wide enough for the hook and ladder or doing traffic calming, then they reacted. And so Ian was in my hometown. We brought him in to do a traffic calming plan in my hometown. And in a town that's 1 square mile and a population of 3,500, we were blessed with 4 volunteer fire departments. And we are blessed. But that meant we had 4 fire chiefs to deal with. And Ian went in and he talked about the whole system all at once. And he got them involved from the beginning and said, what are the key streets for getting your trucks around, and how do we handle that? And then, can we agree that on these other streets, most of the streets in Lambertville where I live, it's a rectangular town, so most of the streets are like 2 blocks long, maybe 3 blocks long, and we got the fire department to say, well, what's the difference if they're, go at 25 or 20 miles an hour as opposed to 40 down the street? The time savings is like 2 seconds. But the one main street, which ran 1.5 miles the length of town, we made sure there wasn't any traffic calming on that. So I think that's an approach to deal with the emergency responders. You can't just, if you put an individual issue in front of their nose, they're going to react to that individual issue. Peter.
Gary, when you talk about having a network so you can share the load and sort of maintenance isn't overloaded, that's very positive. Of course, the flip side of that is now you're getting all this cut-through traffic, which everybody opposes. So, can you say something about how do you either avoid that opposition, or how do you limit the amount of through traffic that's going to use roads that shouldn't have through traffic?
Well, it's going to be easier to avoid the opposition. This is principle is easier applied for a new development, and people will come in and they'll buy based on what's there. It's much more difficult if you go into like the community in Hamilton that was there for 50 or 60 years to try to go deal with the cut-through. So number one, let's, I think, start dealing mostly with the existing system. I heard a statistic somewhere that half of the built form in 2030 will have been built starting today. And so if we start applying these principles by 2030, we'll have at least half of it right, plus whatever percentage is right now. And then over a period of time, go back in and start working with some of the existing communities. But maybe you deal with pedestrian connections at first and bicycle connections. There's a whole other thing, another Ian Lockwood graphic about it's kind of an illusion in a certain extent that to cut through traffic. If you have enough of a network, you distribute it, and okay, maybe the person that could have been living on a cul-de-sac is going to get more cars going through, but there's other people, but that's only going to be 20% of the people in the network. Sooner or later, all of these cul-de-sacs dump out onto the first level road and the second level road, and so then you're going to end up with half of your subdivision with higher traffic than they would have had if you had the network. So that's not an easy sell for an existing subdivision, because I bought my home, I paid a premium to be on the cul-de-sac, but for new development, it works. What do you think?
Well, I really like your the one example where you couldn't build that highway bypass, but instead you said, especially you put in another
Mhm.
As the developments are built, everybody contributes their piece of this additional collector, because, so that seems to be something that makes a lot of sense. And, all the developers, like you said, they just want to build their local roads. They don't want to contribute anything to any traffic other than their immediate traffic. And with very small, with some advanced planning and very, very small incremental cost, you can leverage that so that they contribute to building a network.
See, there's another principle. I'm going to say something, and hopefully we can tie it back in. It's these people on the weekends. I know in New Jersey on the weekends, people when the weather's nice and they get in their car and they go someplace to visit and they go choose to invest their money and go on vacation and they go visit. They go visit places that have walkable neighborhoods, connected networks, the richness of that environment. And as a consequence, the property values in those places are 5 times, literally in New Jersey in some spots, 5 times what they are elsewhere. And then they go back home to a disconnected network, spread out, no walkability, and you don't think much of it. Until somebody comes in and tries to build in that farm field behind them, and then everybody in that existing subdivision with the disconnected network intuitively opposes, right? I mean, the theory in New Jersey, and it's probably the same in Massachusetts and where you guys all live, is that, the farmland, it could develop up to about 30 or 40%, and then all of a sudden you get enough of an opposition to try to stop the rest of the developments coming in. People intuitively know that that kind of stuff is just going to cause more traffic and make their life miserable. So I remember a case study not too far from DOT, abandoned GM site, where we were down talking to the town, and they had been fighting with the existing neighborhoods for 15 years trying to get development in. And it was, typical subdivision. And the people intuitively knew it was going to cause them nothing but problems. I said to him, to the business administrator, name some of your favorite places to visit, or maybe take a poll with these people. Annapolis, Maryland, where I live, in Lambertville, New Jersey, Princeton, Corning, New York. Why not go in and recreate that there, put it next to their houses? They could walk into it, their property values are going to go up, and their neighborhood gets richer. So, I think that we're just approaching this wrong, Peter, in terms of, one project at a time, not thinking about the whole thing. My job is not land use, my job is not health, my job is not the climate, and that's the result. Is there another?
The land use component of that is so critical in what we get down to talking about in 2 dimensions, or thinking about from above, these streets, the networks, and how it's all coming together in design. Forget about the vertical element, the quality of the spaces that frame that. And that's really what LEED is getting at, is looking very closely at those design decisions, not just in 2 dimensions, but 3 dimensions, and how the zoning codes have to support that through form-based coding or other methods. That, you can have all the great networks in the world, but if you've got bad parking design and ratios and not good urban design and not mixed uses, it's just not going to work to the degree that it can. So again, thinking about the land use and the urban design in 3 dimensions is really critical to this, and LEED is trying to support that.
Do we have another speaker?
Yep.
Okay, so you go. What do you want to do?
What do we got, 4:45?
Yeah.
I think we'll just wrap it up. I mean, unless there's any more questions, we're out of our time.
I'll stay as long as somebody buys me a beer, but